Hello, my name is Susan Lord, and I'm a professor and chair of integrated engineering at the University of San Diego. I'm also trained as an electrical engineer and have been chair of electrical engineering for a number of years. I'd like to talk to you about Latinas and Latinos in ECE, including sharing some of my thoughts on data, strategies for faculty, and ideas for change. So the brief outline of my talk is that I'll start out with the data, both quantitative and qualitative, and then I'll have a section on what can ECE departments do, and the focus here is really on faculty, and then think some brief ideas about what ECE at HSI, this coalition, could do to help promote and institute change. So I like to have interactive sections of most of my talks, which is a little more challenging if I'm recording it asynchronously. So I'd like you to think, as you're watching this, of in terms of the percentage of women, how does electrical engineering compare to other engineering disciplines? And think to yourself, if you choose A, that EE has a higher percentage of women than other engineering disciplines, B is about average, or C, the EE lags behind. So pick one of those. All right, the correct answer is C, that EE lags behind other disciplines. The percentages of women at the start at a graduation are lower than in every other discipline within engineering, except for mechanical engineering, which is comparable. But if you look at any other discipline in engineering, there are a higher percentage of women than in electrical or mechanical. How about true or false? Do women drop out of engineering at higher rates than men? So think about that for a second. As you're thinking about that, the data that I'm going to show you regarding this is from the Midfield data set, or the multiple institution database for investigating engineering longitudinal development. This is a group of, at the time the data I'm showing you, it's from 11 public universities, mostly in the southeastern United States. But this is being expanded up to 100. If your institution is interested in joining Midfield, please do let me know. This represents, even at the time with only 11 institutions, 1/9 of the engineering graduates in the US, over 1 million unique students, including over 20 years, and including more than 200,000 engineering students. Thus, the data set is robust enough to permit intersectional analysis, meaning disaggregating by both race, ethnicity, and gender simultaneously. So for example, we can look at how do Latinas do in electrical engineering, as opposed to just how do women do in engineering. And it is longitudinal. It follows individual students as they go through their college career. And so we can calculate things like graduation rate. All right, so it is a myth that women drop out of engineering at higher rates than men. Women graduate at the same or better rates than men in engineering for every race that we studied. So if you look here for the 6-year graduation rates in engineering, the filled in circles are the females and the open circles are the males. And you can see that for several races, it's pretty close, and in every case, women are at the same rate or better than men. So the myth that I've still heard promulgated, even since we published this data several years ago, is that women graduate at lower rates, and that simply is not true. If you don't remember anything else from my talk, please do remember this so that we can give accurate information to young women who are considering coming into engineering. How about Latino and Latina engineering students are less likely to persist than white students? Is this true or false? If you looked carefully at the data that I showed last time, you would see that when we look at the Latina population labeled as Hispanic, because that's how the students could self-identify, that the dots for the Latino population are quite close to that for the white population. Latinas do a little bit better than white students, and Latinos do a little bit worse, but they all have graduation rates here over 50%. And some of the other data I'll show you is that actually Latina transfer students are the most successful among all our engineering transfer students. And Latinas in engineering, industrial engineering, are the most successful starter population that we have. So clearly any myths about Latinos not being capable of doing engineering are false. If we do look at Latinx students in engineering, there's a few data points here I'd like to share. There have been increases in the numbers of Latinx students receiving bachelor's degrees in engineering in the US. If you look at 1991, it was only 7% of all BS degrees in engineering went to Latino students, and by 2014, it's up to 10%. Latinas in particular have risen from about 4% in 1977 to about a quarter looking at 2014. I do think it's very important to recognize throughout this that recruitment is really critical. Latinx engineering students are successful. A lot of the issues are in recruiting them into engineering in the beginning, not necessarily as many issues with retaining them. Latinx transfer students, I think, really do bear a mention here that 40% of the Latinx students in Midfield who are ever engineers are transfer students, and this is higher than for white students where it's only 30%. and 51% of Latino college students in community college, compared to only 34% of white students who are in community college. So the community college pathway, which I'm sure many of you know, is really important for Latinx students. Latino graduate transfer students have the highest 6-year graduation rate of any group we studied in Midfield at 72%, which is amazing. Latinos are at 63%, which is equal to Asians and is still outstanding. And there's some speculation that this may be due to the resilience of our Latinx students, including a personal agency or internal drive or a mi fuerza, or that inner fire to succeed. So how does electrical engineering compare to other disciplines? We started out in the beginning saying maybe it wasn't so good. One of the studies that we conducted looked at the 5 largest engineering disciplines, so chemical, civil, electrical, industrial, and mechanical. And again, students could self-report their race, ethnicity, and they got to choose from Asian, Black, Hispanic, and white. So engineering discipline does make a difference, and the most popular disciplines that students choose at the start and at graduation do depend on both race and gender. So for male engineering students, electrical and mechanical are the most popular choices at start and graduation. For Latinos, mechanical and electrical are about equal, but for other populations, there's a preference. For female engineering students, however, the situation is different. Electrical doesn't make it into the top choices for most female students. Latinas at the start prefer chemical and industrial, and by graduation, industrial is their most popular with chemical next to it. So as we think about trying to attract more Latinx students to engineering, I think it's important to look at these disciplinary differences. Engineering discipline definitely matters. This is graduation rate starters, so those who start in the discipline and look 6 years later as to if they have graduated or not. The industrial engineering has the highest overall graduation rate across each of the populations studied, and electrical has the lowest. So I'd like to just point out a couple of things. One is looking at the Latinas here who have close to an 80% graduation rate in industrial engineering. This is phenomenal. Unfortunately, we don't see this for every discipline. And when we look down at electrical, that's where we see the lowest graduation rates. The Latinas who were successful almost at 80% in industrial are only at about 50% graduation rate in electrical. So what's going on there? That behooves us as electrical engineers to think about what is it about our discipline that perhaps needs to be improved. I do want to point out that industrial engineering is different. All populations that we studied, except for Black men, where it's at least the closest in terms of gained students. They actually gained numbers of students. Some of this has to do with students not being familiar with industrial when they start, but it also really speaks to industrial engineering being able to attract students, men and women from all races and ethnicities. And so it encourages us, I think, in electrical to think about what are the lessons we might learn from industrial engineering and how to attract students once they are in college. I also want to have you think briefly and show some data about migrators. I think sometimes in electrical engineering, maybe true throughout engineering as well, we have this feeling that, you know, students who didn't start with us are kind of damaged goods, or they're not really as strong as the ones who started with us, that there's something wrong with them. And in fact, the data does not bear this out. In fact, the students who migrate in, who started in some other discipline and then chose to come into our disciplines, most of the time have higher graduation rates. This data shows starter graduation rates on the horizontal axis and migrator graduation rates on the vertical axis. The line, the diagonal line in each panel shows if the starter graduation rates and migrator graduation rates were equal. And we can see that in most cases, they're not equal, and most of the time, the migrators have the higher graduation rate. So for example, in chemical engineering over here, when we look at the Latina students, again, the filled in circles are the women and the open circles are the men. So here the H filled in is our Latinas, are graduating in chemical engineering if they migrate in at rates close to around 80%. When we look at industrial engineering, we see these very high graduation rates. We see that the graduation rates of starters are a little higher than migrators, but recognize that these are all very high rates. So I think that is contributing to what was happening here as well. For electrical, which is our focus here, we can see that, again, the migrators are more successful than the starters, and that the women are actually more successful than the men. In mechanical engineering, Latinas are actually at equal graduation rate for starters and migrators, but the Latinos are actually more successful as migrators. So as we consider all that data, one of the things that it brings up, I think, are the challenges that electrical engineering is faced with. Some of that is that there are fewer women than men at the start and at graduation. Percentages of women are comparable to mechanical, but lower than all other engineering disciplines. This points to a recruitment problem. What kind of messages are young people getting about electrical engineering that means that we're not attracting the women, and this includes Latinas? Students graduate in electrical engineering in 6 years at lower rates than in industrial, civil, and mechanical, comparable rates to chemical. This points to a retention problem for our starters. Students even who start with us are not graduating at higher rates that they could be in other disciplines. One of the biggest places where we can increase the number of students that we are graduating is to hold on to the ones who choose to come to us at some point. Electrical engineering loses about 22% of women and men from start to graduation. Most disciplines do lose some, but we don't attract in a whole bunch of others either. So this points to a retention problem for both starters and transfers. Further, in terms of learning from other disciplines, in addition to learning from industrial engineering, something about what's helping them to attract more students, how about mechanical engineering? Mechanical engineering has higher graduation rates, but they have about the same numbers of students. Electrical and mechanical are often comparable in numbers, particularly in the time frame studied here. Percentages of women are pretty comparable between mechanical and electrical, and the losses of students. But something's happening within mechanical where they're able to hold on to more of their students and graduate them. And I do encourage you to consider those migrators. J.R.R. Tolkien of the Fellowship of the Ring fame does have a quote of all who wander are not lost. So some students may just take a little longer to come into, say, electrical engineering, but are we welcoming them or appreciating them as much as we perhaps should be? So that was the quantitative data. I'd like to share some qualitative data now. So I'd like to share a few themes that emerged from a book that my colleague Michelle Madsen Camacho in sociology and I did a few years ago. This is called The Borderlands of Education and focuses on Latinas in engineering. So we describe how Latinas occupy intersecting borderlands. So as women, they're on the borders of the masculine space of engineering. But as Latinos, they have faced societal obstacles, including a legacy of racism. There are a small number of Latinas in engineering, only about 2% overall, but we use their voices and experiences to illuminate broader structural problems within engineering education, issues related to sexism and racism. This is data based on focus groups at several different institutions, and the themes that I want to describe briefly are needing to prove oneself, redefining ideas of success or learning to fail, and learning how to cope socially. These focus groups were not specifically electrical engineering students, but I think that these issues do span all the different disciplines of engineering. So Latinas talk about having to prove themselves and proving themselves multiple times. People who second guess their commitment to pursuing engineering or describe them feeling like they're excluded both as a woman and as a person of color, comments about they're only here because they're a woman or that they're only an affirmative action contribution. The quote at the bottom talks about someone saying, a student saying, you know, a lot of my guy friends went into engineering, but they didn't get into this prestigious institution and they were jealous. And then they'd be like, well, you're a girl and you're Hispanic going into engineering. Why would they not take you? And the student saying, well, no, it's because my GPA is higher than yours and my SAT scores are higher and I'm more involved in school. So being constantly faced with this burden of having to prove that you indeed were competent, regardless of the actual competence. Latinas also talk about learning to fail, and we heard this more from the Latinas than from women in other focus groups. So one of the quotes from them is, you know, learning to fail is something you had to do in college. Learning that you're not good at everything, that's a huge shock to the system. And some of what they described here were what they called frustrations with curved grading. That if in engineering, oftentimes we grade on a curve, and so perhaps the teaching's not always fabulous, and there may be many reasons for this, but it is not uncommon for students to have a low score, like maybe a 41 on a test, and then be told, well, if the mean was 22, then that 41 is an A. And there are reasonable people, and this includes Latinas, as well as other women and some men, who have a hard time with this. Even if someone tells you, well, you actually did very well and you are considered a success, they still feel like they failed because they didn't know how to do 60% of the test. And so the messages that women get it and internalize are very strong about this feeling like they failed. And then this idea of coping with low grades and not being devastated. these were high achieving students in high school. Some of them, they're not actually getting low grades. They are just getting low grades on exams, but not on their courses. And others maybe were struggling as they were in this competitive environment. And the last theme that we saw from Latinas was this idea of having real friends and then engineering friends. And so they talk about having, people they can talk about with the academics, but those aren't their real friends. And so Latinas were more likely to join engineering societies that offered support to women of color, such as the Society for Hispanic Professional Engineers, SHIP. And they talked about professional development rather than social opportunities as the reason for joining. And this bifurcation of having one set of friends for academic interactions and one for social is found in the literature for women of color throughout different disciplines. But it is really problematic given the fact that oftentimes that support from academic peers is critical to students' academic success. Okay, so what can electrical engineering educators do? I think there's a number of different things that we can do. One is to examine our own assumptions, attitudes, and teaching behaviors. We all have biases. Having biases is not the problem. It's how do we enact out those biases in the classroom. If you're not familiar with the implicit bias tests at Harvard, that's an interesting place to go to study all different kinds of implicit bias. Some other things that we can do include modeling inclusive language. So instead of talking about freshman students, which has a gendered connotation, we can talk about first-year students. This is more clear to folks in other countries and perhaps is more appropriate for some of our returning students if they're non-traditional aged. Being careful of our language so that we're always trying to be as welcoming as we can. So things like students should hand in their homework rather than each student should hand in his homework. And some of this material I took from the ASEE's Safe Zone training, which is available on the web. What can we do? We can also think about what we teach and how we teach. I encourage you to use examples if you're a professor. Use examples with a variety of applications and people. Oftentimes we don't have any people in our examples, and I think that's a problem. But as we are bringing in examples, are we careful about thinking about who we're featuring and the messages we might be sending about who belongs in engineering or who does well in engineering? So for example, here are a number of African-American engineers, scientists, mathematicians. Are these featured in what you do? I'm a big fan of Hidden Figures over here. If you're a STEM faculty member and you haven't seen Hidden Figures, please go see Hidden Figures. There are many people who have contributed to STEM in excellent ways. Are we sharing those stories? So this particular slide features members of the Latinx community who have contributed. As well as, are we featuring women? Remember, for Latinas, we're looking at both ethnicity and gender. So there's a number of different folks here. For most of us are familiar probably with a bug in a computer, and we can see here Grace Hopper, who coined that term when she literally found a moth dead on one of the vacuum tubes in a big computer. Lynn Conway, if you're familiar with VLSI design, Conway and Mead is the big textbook that's used for that, and Lynn Conway is a transgender woman. She's actually giving a talk at Connected at the end of January. When we think about the examples that we bring in our classrooms, do all our examples look like this top circuit diagram? Or do we also bring in examples that may tie more to students' experience? So do we talk about things like the right to repair movement as we think about trying to think about the impact of our circuits at the end of their life? Do we talk about solar cells and the potential that they have? Do we talk about cell phones, perhaps, and that we know many students are interested in that? Issues related to bioengineering, which is what the bottom left picture is supposed to represent. I did optoelectronics in graduate school, so I'm a fan of that. And I think electrical engineering students complain often that things are too abstract. So I like the optoelectronics because then they can see things. Do we talk about education and the power of electrical engineering for education? Disaster relief is an application for some of our concepts, and as opposed to just things like rockets or cars. I've also been doing some recent work on issues, say, of conflict minerals. So are we able to connect what we do in electrical engineering to the larger global context? So do we introduce a capacitor as the circuit symbol that's shown here, or what they can get at the back of a lab? Do we talk about what it's made of and where that is mined and the impact that that has on the folks who do the mining? Some other general advice is in teams and labs not to isolate women or minorities, to assign and rotate roles in lab partners so people don't fall back on stereotypes of having the woman be the recorder because she has neat handwriting. Model expectations ourselves of professionalism, both inside and outside the classroom and lab. Our own tolerance for sexist, racist jokes or language carries over into messages about what is appropriate for students. And I think it's really important that we show that engineers have lives outside of electrical engineering. Some students feel that the message they're getting told is that unless they want to commit their entire life to electrical engineering, they don't belong. And I don't think that has to be true. These ideas benefit all students, but particularly benefit students who may not feel as welcome in the classroom. So for example, this is how I introduce myself to my students. I'm careful to include my qualifications, but also to include things about my family so that they can see that I do have a life outside of electrical engineering. I am passionate about what I do as an educator, but it is not the only part of my life. I also encourage folks to put an inclusive classroom statement on the syllabus. This is one taken from that ASCE Safe Zone training that makes it a statement that you do welcome everyone in your classroom, and they are all valuable members of the class. This may be particularly helpful for folks with non-visible differences who may then feel comfortable approaching you. I think it behooves us all to consider the kinds of pedagogy that we use in engineering and the messages that they send. Typically, things are very lecture-based, competitive with the curved grading that I already talked about some of the problems with weed out classes where students feel like they are being, it's an adversarial relationship and they're expected not to succeed. We have this myth that things are objective, and oftentimes that just means that it's disconnected from students' lived experiences. And we have this model often of this banking model of our just pouring knowledge into the student that had no knowledge to begin with. And Paulo Freire is particularly critical of that, saying that's not really what is happening in real life. But these sorts of pedagogies do promote the idea that we're not expecting our students to be successful and we're sort of making them work hard to try to succeed. I'm not saying they don't have to work hard, but can it be more collaborative, which I think represents more of engineering and more of a belief that they can be successful. So I encourage folks to use innovative pedagogies, including active learning, things that incorporate teamwork directly, community engagement or service learning. There's some pictures here showing with that, and culturally responsive teaching, where we try to think about having examples and having content that relates directly to things that the students are interested in. Encourage us to think about the ECE canon, and I don't mean this kind of a canon pictured here. Instead, I mean the body of knowledge of what is critical for electrical engineering. Who decides what belongs in that canon? Do we even recognize that we have a canon? And whose knowledge is valued in creating that? Are we really getting a broad spectrum of people involved? And can we reimagine both the format and content of what ECE curriculum might look like? I do want to talk briefly about stereotype threat, because I think this is something that is all around us and particularly is felt by Latinx students as well as all of our female students in engineering. And if we can be a little more aware, perhaps we can help mitigate the effects. So this is the anxiety a person feels when they are in a testing or performance situation where they could potentially confirm a negative stereotype about a social group with which they identify. So for example, there's a stereotype that women are not very good at math. And so in the picture on the left, it's like, wow, you suck at math. There's no stereotype threat there. But when we have one of the people here now be a girl, and the comment comes up, girls suck at math, then we have this larger, like, of course you're fulfilling being bad at math because you're a girl. Some strategies to reduce stereotype threat, these are taken from a paper that some colleagues and I did at the 2014 Frontiers in Education Conference, are encouraging students to affirm their personal values, remember why they're studying engineering, communicate high standards and the belief in students' ability to meet them, having fair exams that measure learning, not innate ability or something, with clear expectations for evaluation. When students don't have clear expectations, they may worry that something about their identity may come into play. Instructors can convey that successful engineers are not born, but developed through consistent hard work. This goes along with Carol Dweck's growth mindset work. I think this is important for all faculty as well as for all parents. So sometimes we have the tendency, for example, to say, wow, you did well on that exam, you're so smart. If we send that kind of a message, the problem is for both our children and our students is that if they have another exam where they don't do well, then they say, oh, well, this must mean that I'm not smart. And so then the tendency may be, well, I just won't put myself in the situation where I might be not smart. Instead, if we focus on, wow, you've worked hard to learn this difficult material, great job. Then if a student doesn't do as well on a subsequent exam, there's a sense of, oh, well, I need to work harder. I can work harder in order to be more successful. So this growth mindset rather than a fixed mindset is really important. And the third one is to have this sense of belonging by helping students learn that worrying about belonging and struggling is fine. And that is normal. That is what most people do. And some of the things that can be done here are interventions that have more senior students talk to more to first year students, and then those students talk to incoming students. Even if they don't remember hearing this, it has been shown to have benefits for their academic achievement. What can folks at ECE, at HSI possibly do? So I just gathered several thoughts of things I think might be good to have on the table for promoting Latinas in engineering, electrical engineering. I think partnering with ECEDHA, the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department Heads Association, on their new faculty initiative, things like the I Redefine, or improving the diversity of faculty, electrical and computer engineering. For undergraduate students, participation in the 50K Coalition. Carl Reed at NSBE has been one of the folks spearheading this, but folks at SHIP have also been working hard at this with the idea of having 50,000 diverse engineers graduating annually by 2025. Address climate, encouraging faculty to go to the ASCE Safe Zone Ally training workshops. These are done online and face-to-face. And I think it's important that we recognize all different dimensions of diversity and try to be as inclusive as possible. ASCE also has some other inclusive classroom strategy resources that are available online. I think it's important that we improve teaching. I'd like to put in a plug for the National Effective Teaching Institute. I'm one of the facilitators of this. We try to translate best practices in effective teaching in ways that engineering faculty can understand that make sense to them. So we have a NETI 1 that's an introduction in person, about 2.5 days. NETI 2 that's advanced in person, 1.5 days. And then we have started doing NETI 3 online via Zoom in 2 4-hour sessions, and the website's listed there. The Women in Engineering Proactive Network, WEPAN, has partnered with NSF to do Engage, or about engaging students in engineering. They have a really nice section on everyday examples in engineering, but there's not a lot of examples of electrical engineering and computer engineering topics. So I encourage folks to submit more of those so that this can be a more valuable resource for our discipline. I think we should think about how to move ECE off the borderlands. Most people don't know what engineering or electrical engineering really is, and this contributes to being a segregated elite enclave. This is part of why we have such a narrow slice of the population actually involved in our endeavor. Engineering is largely absent from K-12, so it's not familiar. People aren't sure what it is, which contributes to it being more elitist. The next generation science standards, which have come out fairly recently and adopted by a number of states, do offer a real opportunity to help change the culture of engineering and who does engineering and electrical engineering. If we can participate with K-12 endeavors here and show what electrical engineering really is in reasonable ways, this may be very helpful to folks in making an educated decision about if they want to pursue it. If, however, all we do is keep throwing paper airplanes and call that engineering, this won't help. And engineering is not usually part of the core or general education for most college students, so they also don't know much about what it is. Perhaps if engineering were included in more of the general engineering education requirements, we'd have a more informed citizenry in the 21st century with greater technical literacy. I'm not talking about having students take a third year electronics class. I'm talking about having all students take some sort of an introduction to engineering or something that describes the engineering design process and gives them some experience. And I think that having more people have knowledge about engineering would help make it less exclusive and more diverse. I also think we should try to value multiple pathways and get away from the pipeline model. Often the elitism manifests also in that we really have this preference for people starting out with our discipline and then finishing it, and anything else is a leak and is something that's an unacceptable outcome. But that's not what most people's pathways really are. And so I think as a discipline, it's important for us to think about ways we can welcome people and let them understand and value multiple ways of coming in and then multiple ways of being successful once they graduate. This is particularly important, I think, for Latinx students who are more likely than students of other races to enroll in community colleges and thus not take the pipeline model here. And again, we're those transfer students, those Latina transfers who were so successful. We should make sure that we are valuing them. And HSIs, which many of you probably know a lot more than I do about, are critically important in this whole endeavor. In graduating 40% of the Latinx engineering students over this study, the time period that we studied here. Most HSIs are 2-year institutions, which again makes us think about the importance of providing pathways between community college and 4-year institutions. And Latinx students in states where there's high Latinx populations are more likely to go directly to a 4-year college than a 2-year college compared with students of other races. It's making it more important for us to consider geography as we do some of this work. I think that all of this work requires us to really focus on some deep-seated problems, to recognize that changing culture is incredibly difficult, and to acknowledge and try our best to dismantle both the racism and the sexism that is in engineering, including electrical and computer engineering. The last thing I just wanted to mention is this idea of challenging the deficit-based approaches that we have too often in our approach to all underrepresented populations. So for Latinx students in particular, there's an assumption often that Latinx individuals are coming with all sorts of deficits, whether this is motivational or cognitive or preparation. And the research in engineering education is often focused on the needs of students of color, failing to recognize the assets that they bring. So emerging research is looking more at new sources of knowledge through things like the funds of knowledge and asset-based approaches, and creating empowering pedagogies that celebrate the cultural, ethnic, and linguistic differences of students, rather than perceiving those differences as deficits. There's some excellent work by one of my colleagues at USD, Dr. Alex Mejia, that has focused on this. Here are some of the references that I cited, used things from earlier in the talk. If you wanted to see what those were, happy to share any of them in any other format that's helpful. I'd like to acknowledge both Matt Olin at Purdue and Richard Layton from Rose-Hulman for their contributions to some of the work that I showed earlier as well. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I look forward to talking to you later.